There was a man who had everything: money, power, and connections. His name was Richard, and he had built his wealth through inheritance and business deals. He dressed in the finest suits, drove expensive cars, and looked down on anyone who wasn't in his circle. On the other side of the city there was a young black entrepreneur named James. He had no family wealth, no investors, and no safety net. What he did have was ambition. He had spent years working on his business idea, believing it could change his life. One day, James got a chance to meet Richard. It was an opportunity he had waited for, a chance to pitch his idea to a man with the power to open doors. James approached him with confidence, hoping for support. But instead of listening, Richard laughed. He didn't take James seriously at all. James stood in front of Richard, holding on to his confidence. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. He knew his business idea had potential, and he believed all he needed was the right person to see it. "Sir, I have a business idea that I believe could be highly profitable," James said with a steady voice. Richard barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, and what kind of business could you possibly have?" He smirked. James explained his idea with passion. He talked about the market demand, his strategy, and his vision. He was prepared, professional, and determined. But Richard wasn't impressed. He let out a loud, mocking laugh. "You? A businessman? That's hilarious." People around them turned to look. James felt their eyes on him, but he kept his composure. Richard shook his head. "Listen, kid. Business isn't for everyone. Some people are just meant to work for others. You really think someone like you can build something big?" James clenched his fists but remained calm. "I believe in my idea, and one day, you'll see that I was right." Richard chuckled again. "Good luck with that." He waved James away as if he were nothing more than a joke. James walked away, not in defeat, but with more determination than ever. If Richard didn't believe in him, he would prove him wrong. James walked away from that humiliating encounter, but Richard's words stayed in his mind. Not because he believed them, but because they fueled his fire. He had faced doubt before, but this time, it felt personal. He wasn't just proving himself right, he was proving Richard wrong. James had always been a hard worker. He had grown up in a neighborhood where success wasn't easy. Money was always tight, and opportunities were rare. He had worked multiple jobs since he was a teenager, saving every dollar he could. His business idea had come from his own experiences. He had seen a gap in the market, something people needed but no one was providing. He had spent years researching, learning, and building his concept. The problem was, he didn't have the money to launch it properly. After Richard's rejection, James started grinding even harder. He worked long hours during the day and spent his nights refining his business plan. He reached out to small investors, mentors, and anyone who would listen. Most ignored him, some gave polite refusals. But James didn't stop. He found creative ways to fund his idea. He used his savings, borrowed from friends, and even took on side gigs to raise money. He taught himself marketing, business management, and finance. When he couldn't afford something, he found a way to do it himself. The first version of his business was small. It wasn't flashy or perfect, but it worked. Slowly, customers started noticing. Word spread, and his client base grew. Every dollar James earned, he reinvested into his business. He upgraded his products, improved his services, and built a brand. His name started gaining recognition in the industry. He was still far from success, but he was no longer invisible. James never forgot how Richard had laughed at him. But instead of holding on to anger, he let it drive him. He didn't need Richard's approval or investment. He was building something real on his own. And soon, the world would take notice. James had been grinding for years. His business was growing. But progress was slow. He faced setbacks, financial struggles, and moments of doubt, but he never considered giving up. One day, he met someone who changed everything. A well-respected entrepreneur named Mr. Carter. Unlike Richard, Mr. Carter saw potential in James. He wasn't interested in status or background. He cared about vision and hard work. James met him at a small networking event. He wasn't even supposed to be there, but he had found a way in. When he finally got a chance to speak with Mr. Carter, he didn't waste a second. "I started my business from nothing," James said. "I've been growing it step by step, but I need the right guidance to take it to the next level." Mr. Carter listened. He asked questions. He didn't laugh. Instead, he gave James advice, real, practical steps to scale his business. He even introduced James to a few people who could help. That moment marked a shift. James took every piece of advice seriously. He restructured his business, focused on marketing, and optimized his operations. He started attracting bigger clients. His revenue increased. Investors who had once ignored him began showing interest. But James wasn't just growing financially, he was becoming a respected name in his industry. People started inviting him to business events, podcasts, and interviews. He became known for his resilience and innovative thinking. Meanwhile, Richard remained unaware of James' rise. To him, James was just another nobody who had disappeared after their brief encounter. He never expected to hear that name again. But that was about to change. James had now built something undeniable. His business had reached a level where even the most powerful people had to take notice. His company was featured in major publications. Industry leaders praised his work. Then, something unexpected happened. James was invited to a high-profile business conference. The same conference where Richard would be one of the keynote speakers. James accepted the invitation without hesitation. This time, he wouldn't be the one asking for an opportunity. He would be standing among the successful. And Richard, whether he liked it or not, would have to see it. The grand ballroom was filled with the wealthiest and most influential business figures. It was an exclusive event, one where deals were made, partnerships were formed, and reputations were solidified. Richard was in his element. He thrived in spaces like this, surrounded by power and luxury. He had been invited as a keynote speaker, and he was ready to impress. But as he walked through the event, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, something caught his attention. A name. "Have you heard about James Carter?" one man said to another. "His company is making waves. Investors are lining up." Richard frowned. That name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Then, as he made his way to the stage, he noticed a group gathered around someone at the other end of the room. Curious, he moved closer. And then he saw him. James stood there, dressed in a sharp suit, confidently speaking with business leaders. He looked completely different from the young man Richard had laughed at years ago. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't begging for attention. People were listening to him, respecting him. Richard's stomach tightened. He overheard someone ask James how he started. James smiled. "I pitched my idea to a wealthy investor once," he said. "He laughed at me, told me I wasn't meant for business." The people around him chuckled. "Bet he regrets that now." James nodded. "I hope so." Richard felt a rush of embarrassment. He realized at that moment that James was talking about him. Memories of that encounter flooded back. He had dismissed James without a second thought. He had laughed, mocked him, and sent him away as if he was nothing. And now, that same man was standing among giants. Richard's confidence wavered. He had always believed in his ability to spot potential, yet he had completely misjudged James. While he had spent years maintaining his wealth, James had been building something new, something that had grown far beyond what Richard had imagined. For the first time in years, Richard felt small. He wanted to walk away and pretend he didn't see James. But he also felt something else: regret. What if he had taken James seriously? What if he had invested in him instead of mocking him? How much richer would he be now? But it was too late for what-ifs. James had risen without him, and now Richard was just another man watching from the sidelines. Richard hesitated for a moment, then straightened his suit and walked toward James. He wasn't used to feeling nervous, but something about this situation unsettled him. James was still surrounded by influential people, engaged in conversation. His confidence was undeniable. He wasn't the struggling entrepreneur Richard had once dismissed. He was a man who had earned his place. Richard cleared his throat. "James," he said with a polite smile. James turned, his eyes meeting Richard's. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then James smiled, not with bitterness, but with quiet understanding. "Richard," he said, nodding. "It's been a while." Richard chuckled awkwardly. "Yes, it has. I've been hearing a lot about you. Seems like you've done well for yourself." James gave a small shrug. "I've been working hard. It's funny though. A few years ago, I couldn't even get 5 minutes of your time." Richard forced a laugh. "Oh, come on, James, that was just business. You know how it is. I meet so many people pitching ideas, I can't take them all seriously." James didn't react. He simply let Richard's words hang in the air. Richard shifted his stance. Listen, I'd love to hear more about your company. Maybe there's a way we can collaborate. I think we could do some great things together. James studied him for a moment. He could see the desperation hidden behind Richard's polished exterior. Years ago, he had stood in front of this man, eager for his approval. But now, the roles had reversed. James smiled. That's an interesting idea, Richard, he said. But I already have the right partners, people who believed in me before success came. Richard's smile faltered. Of course, he said, trying to keep his composure. But still, maybe we could. James shook his head gently. I appreciate the conversation, but I have to get back to my team. He extended his hand. Richard hesitated but shook it. The handshake was firm, but it wasn't a business deal. It was a goodbye. As James turned and walked away, Richard was left standing alone. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the man others were chasing. He wasn't the one in control. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be overlooked. Richard watched as James walked away, surrounded by powerful business figures. He had always been the man others chased, the one people wanted to impress. But now, he was on the outside looking in. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in his chest. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, one truth remained. He had been wrong. He thought back to the day he had laughed at James. Back then, he had seen nothing but a young man with an impossible dream. He had dismissed him without a second thought. He had mocked him, treated him as if he didn't belong in the business world. And now, that same man had built something bigger than Richard himself. The regret settled in. If he had taken James seriously, things could have been different. He could have been part of that success. He could have invested early, supported him, and grown alongside him. But instead, his arrogance had blinded him. He had let his pride stop him from seeing true potential. Now James was untouchable. He didn't need Richard. He had found his own way, built his own empire, and surrounded himself with people who believed in him. Richard clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to losing. He had always been the one making the deals, calling the shots. But this time, he had lost without even realizing it. As he turned away, he felt something unfamiliar. Emptiness. Money had always been his power, but for the first time he saw its limits. He had underestimated James. And now, all he could do was watch from the sidelines, knowing that he had laughed at the very man who had become everything he had once doubted.